Hi, welcome to the Lhakar series. This is our third episode. Today we'll be talking about the Confucius Institute. And our special guests today are Pema Jama, our SFT Campaigns in Europe Director, and we also have Ugen Vadatang, our SFT Canada Director. Thank you guys for joining us on Lhakar series Confucius Institute Uncovered.
Thank you, Pema, for having us.
Thanks for organizing.
Thank you. Okay, so let's get started. We're talking about Confucius Institute, and Confucius Institute is something that SFT have been talking about for a while. I know we've been doing a lot of research. We've been talking to people at events about it, and people are really. We know that people and our students and our members are getting excited about this campaign. We can see that China is. It seems that they're using their soft power to sort of tap onto this sort of global demand of learning Chinese language, and so, but at the same time, it has people concerned, and there seems to be anxiety about this. Can you explain a little bit more, Pema Jama, about what is the Confucius Institute?
Yeah, definitely. That's a really good question. I think a lot of people ask themselves, what is the Confucius Institute? And now so many people have heard about it. And the Confucius Institute, the official stance is that they are a so-called non-profit public institution, and they're affiliated with the Ministry of Education of the People's Republic of China through something called Hanban, and which is basically the Chinese National Office for Teaching Chinese as a Foreign Language. The Confucius Institute was created actually in 2004, so it's just been less than 11 years or almost 11 years, and since then the Chinese government has consistently really increased its financial resources and financial budget to go towards that and to finance this Confucius Institute worldwide. And in 2004, when it was created, it actually first opened in Seoul in Korea, and since then, it's gone up to establishing about 500 institutes up to 2015 today. And as in Xinhua, a Chinese government-sponsored news agency, was stated that the Chinese government actually plans to implement 1,000 Confucius Institutes worldwide by 2020. So, I mean, these are a lot of numbers and facts, but what does the Confucius Institute mean? What does it do, right? That's one of the main questions. And so what this Confucius Institute does, it seeks out partnerships and with academic and educational institutions worldwide. And by that, I mean primary schools, secondary schools, and also higher education. So actually, potentially school children from the age of 6, 7, depending on when the primary school age starts in the country, they could be studying in a Confucius Institute, but even also high school students, who are just about to decide what their future is going to be, just about to be going off to university, but then also as high up as PhD students who are researching potentially Tibet, China, or other topics. And in these Confucius Institutes, basically what the Chinese government offers is they're basically giving money to their academic or educational institution in hosting the Confucius Institute, and they're offering language courses, exchange programs. Sometimes the interest is towards business, sometimes it's language, sometimes it's something cultural. It really depends on the institution itself, what their sort of outlook is on education. But this is what they do on paper. Now, but really what we think as Students for Free Tibet and also many other Tibetan and Chinese activists worldwide, we see the Confucius Institute as a threat, and we'll talk more about it. But what we see the Confucius Institute as is China's attempt to increase their so-called soft power we call it, outside China. And so what that means, soft power means basically taking or increasing one's political influence by changing the opinions. This is basically what the Confucius Institute is.
Okay, thank you, Pema. I think there's a bit of a delay there. Okay, so the Confucius Institute is directly connected to the Chinese government, Chinese Communist government, through the Ministry of Education, their Ministry of Education, the Hanbun. And, you know, these institutes, our universities, are getting funded by the Confucius Institute, getting funded by China. But again, maybe you can tell me more, or tell our audience, our supporters, our members, you know, why should Tibetans and general students and academics be concerned about the Confucius Institutes?
I think there are many reasons why we need to be really concerned about Confucius Institutes. The fact that it is so spread out and we're starting to take action now really speaks to the sneaky way in which they have gotten through up until now. It's almost a decade since they've you know, started implementing them in North America, and the fact is, you know, if we don't do something now to challenge and expose these, we really have a high chance of losing the academic space we have for Tibet. Educational institutions, you know, universities, schools have always been a really important forum for free discussions and scholarship on Tibet. You know, some of the most foremost thinkers produce information and research on Tibet and the situation in Tibet, and these can be hindered by Confucius Institutes. Right now, more than ever, we really need to ensure that the Chinese government is not taking over our schools. There's an apparent, you know, decreasing public support for world government, politicians for publicly meeting His Holiness, and His Holiness is one of the most, you know, well-known advocates for peace. And this almost happened, for example, at Sydney University, right? When the university almost didn't allow His Holiness to speak at that institution. Coincidentally, they have a Confucius Institute at Sydney University. Similarly, like we as activists, as Tibet advocates, would never have thought, you know, in our wildest dreams or nightmares that we'd have to challenge the Chinese government here and this soil in our schools. But that's happening now. Just last year, a Tibetan student was asked not to bring her Tibetan flag to university. And this is Brock University here in Canada. When she asked why, the event organizer just forwarded her an email from the Confucius Institute director. The guy said, you know, as long as she doesn't bring the flag, which is definitely going to cause trouble, it should be fine. So why are these institutes, these so-called Confucius Institutes, which is really, I feel they're just Chinese embassies in our schools. No other school has embassies in our schools. Confucius Institutes have managed to implement themselves, and they've managed to kind of almost become the foremost authority on all things China and Tibet. And we know how repressive the Chinese government is. As Tibetans, our entire region, the plateau of Tibet, is cut off from media, and we know how bad it can be. And now they're bringing it here. Students for Free Tibet, you know, along with all other community organizations and Tibet support groups, I think we need to be really worried about this, especially from the Tibet angle. We don't have the kind of money the Chinese government has, because they will put out all kinds of conferences. They will really try everything to make it look like they have a legitimate claim on the Tibet issue, and we need to really, I think now is the time to challenge them and expose them. And it's not just censorship, it's not just limiting, but it's also preservation by claiming to be the authority on Tibet. There's a slide, Pema, of Confucius Institute's holding a cultural event. I don't know if you can show that on the screen right now. You know, where Tibetans, where they're holding this event called Celebration of Nations. This is the same university, by the way, that tried to stop Tibetan from bringing the flag. You can see that students, you know, innocent students, are wearing dresses from ethnic minorities from the Chinese government, right? And on the far left is a Tibetan, is so-called Tibetan dress. This is complete cultural misappropriation. We shouldn't be seeing this at this time. We live in 2015, and the Confucius Institute is bringing back our schools to the Stone Age. They're like completely insensitive. A culture that is, that people are working so hard to preserve, and now the Chinese government is just throwing it out there without any context. They're making it look like Tibet is a fine place to live in, that you can wear their dresses, the Chinese government will provide it, and nothing is wrong there, right? They're allowing not to bring the Chinese flag. Censorship, propaganda, all of this is happening at these places. Before, it was commonplace for embassies to put these kind of shows on, where people would just wear, fake Tibetan clothing and parade around. But now it's coming to our schools, and that's really troubling. I think our schools are a sacred place, and Tibet needs to be free of these kind of influences, especially here in the West and all around the world.
Yeah, and I think Tibetans should be very concerned. Chinese people should be very concerned. Everyone who has been affected by the Chinese government in the past and in the present, but also really everybody should be concerned. Even people who might not know so much about Tibet or China, or might not, let's say, care so much about what's happening inside China, should also be very concerned. By that I mean students, teachers, administrative workers, from the universities and those schools. They should be very concerned because, if a government like the Chinese government, who we all know is totalitarian, who disrespects human rights, who is undemocratic, who has no respect for freedom of speech, and really doesn't respect basic human rights. If such a government is in charge or has any sort of influence, no matter how small it is, as to what is being learned in the schools, what kind of textbooks the children are using, this is really a problem, because I feel young people and students especially have always, in history, in countries, in movements, have really been such a driving force, and students and young people really are the future for Tibet, but also just, they're the decision makers of tomorrow. And if students, are not able to learn in an environment that is free, democratic, and really exposes them to different ideas, but is being, but are limited in a learning environment that is dictated by a totalitarian regime, I think that's really a problem, and I think that's why everybody should be concerned. Everyone, Tibetans, Chinese, non-Tibetans, Americans, French people, Germans, Japanese, Indians, everybody should be really concerned for the sake of our young people worldwide.
Okay. Thank you, Pema. But I have to ask this question because it keeps coming up sometimes, like in our research and in our work. But Confucius Institute is just a cultural program. It is just to talk about language. It's just to talk about Chinese history and their growing development. And I feel like you have answered some of that question, but this does keep coming up. And maybe you can. So, are we sort of overreacting to this?
I mean, yes, that's actually a very good question, because I think even for us at Students for a Free Tibet, going through the exercise of trying to understand what is the Confucius Institute, what is their agenda, it doesn't look so straightforward, and I think that is exactly the strategy that the Chinese government is trying to use, which is thinking, oh, it looks, it doesn't look so bad, it's just language, and I think by doing that, they can actually hide and really mask what the real reasons are. And I think we as Tibetans, as Tibet campaigners, we know how the Chinese government operates, and we know that the Chinese government is not spending millions and millions of dollars, pounds, euros without advancing their political agenda. But also, if you look at the history of the last 11 years of the history of the Confucius Institutes operating worldwide. Look at the University of Chicago, for example, who was also was there in the beginning, having had a relationship and an agreement with Confucius Institutes. They had this, and they thought in the beginning they were fine, but very soon into the agreement, they realized that something is really wrong. And what happened last year, the University of Chicago, they pulled out and they withdrew from the Confucius Institute because academics, their staff, they were really concerned that very serious censorship and a violation of academic freedom is happening. And what was really clear is that the Chinese government has a very clear strategy of using their propaganda once they're in our schools. So once in our schools, they have, they disperse their own textbooks. They send teachers, who were trained in mainland China. These teachers have been taught that, Tibet was always a part of China, that everybody in Tibet is happy, that Chinese people are happy. And I think, that's a real threat. And for example, also, Ugin, he just mentioned this incident when at Brock, Canada, a Tibetan student was not allowed to bring her Tibetan flag to the school. So even in the beginning, Brock University and everyone involved thought, the Confucius Institute is very harmless. But when, the issue came up of Tibet, actually, they were referring to the Confucius Institute as the main authority to make a decision on Tibet. So that brings me also again to this concept of soft power, right? And soft power, what does it actually mean? Soft power means changing and influencing social and public opinion through, relatively less transparent channels, and lobbying through powerful political and also non-political organizations. And this is exactly what the Chinese government is trying to do with the Confucius Institute. If you think about Tibet, in Tibet, the Chinese government is using military force. When you think about our world governments, the Chinese government is trying to put economic pressure on our world leaders to do what they want. But with the international community, people who, are teachers, students, the very people that we're trying to recruit for the cause of Tibet, these are the people that they're trying to influence through their soft power slowly in our own schools. And and so I think looking at all the incidences in the past when the Confucius Institutes were shut down, when Confucius Institute directors were ripping out pages of conference agendas, when students weren't allowed to bring their school the Tibetan flag, when a Falun Gong Chinese member university with the Confucius Institute. These are all proofs and examples how this is not just a language program.
Okay, great. Thank you for answering that, Pema. So, I think you gave some really strong details there about sort of the threats, and especially to the Tibetan movement. Both of you, I think, explained that. And maybe we can, or Pema, maybe one of you can explain a little bit more about. So, what else is the proof? What other proof is out there that it's an academic threat, and that other students, non-Tibetans, the outside movement, are affected by this?
Yeah, Ugin, do you want to answer or?
No, you can go ahead.
Okay, sure. Well, where to start? There are so many proofs already in the past. I think one of the main proofs is that a lot of Confucius Institutes have already been shut down, actually recently. University of Chicago, Stockholm University, Pennsylvania State University. Also, the story that Ugin was telling us about the Tibetan student who was disallowed from bringing the Tibetan flag. So these are two very definite proofs. But also, you know, for example, the American Association of University Professors, you know, they came out with a very strong statement saying that the CI basically functions as an arm of the Chinese state. You know, so many professors came out with the statement. So all these professors, you know, having different backgrounds, coming from different educational institutions, you know, they saw the real threat. Also, the Canadian Professor Association said something similar. They actually clearly stated that the CIs, they're just an arm of the Chinese government. Also, the Canadian Secret Service also gave testimony about the Confucius Institute being being involved in Chinese espionage, and even, you know, even their own CCP senior, the Chinese Communist Party senior officials have, you know, openly admitted that the Confucius Institutes are actually an important part of China's overseas propaganda setup. You know, and there have been more incidences where, you know, people have been shut down. In the last months, what Students for Free Tibet has been doing is doing a bit of sort of underground research together with other groups worldwide. You know, we've attended their events, and what we see is that any questions about Tibet or anything that is sensitive to China is being shut down. People don't want to talk about it. People are being, you know, asked to leave the room. And we've also talked to professors who are saying to us that actually Chinese overseas students to them and complained about the Confucius Institute because they are scared of being spied upon by the Confucius Institute on their campus. And also there is a fear, I feel, especially among academics and professors that who are in the China field or in the Tibet field, is that in the long run, if we don't stop it now, the Chinese government will slowly replace, you know, our independent scholars with their own scholars who have been trained by the Chinese government, so that actually that the Chinese government will be in control of the jobs, actually, of the professorships, if we don't take action now.
Yeah, these are like exactly the points why we need to be worried. And I can really speak just on the Canadian perspective. I've joined deputations where we have spoken to the Board of Trustees of the Toronto District School Board about the threats of CI when we were campaigning for their termination. Along with me were, you know, democracy activists from China, a former Canadian Secret Intelligence Services agent. He said that the Confucius Institutes are practically a Trojan horse. They're brought in looking like, you know, a gift horse. You know, there looks like there's nothing wrong with it, but he said that they are connected to associations that are directly controlled by the Chinese embassy, and this is a problem because we can't have agents of the embassy working in our schools. Similarly, the Brock incident where a student was asked not to bring the Tibetan flag. We didn't listen to them, obviously. We brought the Tibetan flag the next day to this event, and a lot of people took pictures with us. But this is a symptom of, you know, worse things to come. You know, what if, you know, in the future they can't? There's more restrictions on Tibetans, right? There was an incident in Portugal in 2000, just last year, where their executive director actually tore down pages from an event brochure, ordered them torn at a Chinese conference because they had the name of a Taiwanese association. So they're trying to control the 3 T's: Tibet, Taiwan, Tiananmen, right? You can't imagine that the Confucius Institute will at any point be talking about this or facing these questions. They're not interested in it. In fact, they're interested in hiding them, right? They're interested in painting a glorious picture of China. Like Pema Thomas said, it's part of their major global soft power scheme, and they're buying it off. It's just here in Canada, I've seen enough to know that these are a major threat to our freedom. The problem is that they are so deeply, some of them are quite deeply entrenched because they the agreement has been there for years now, and they're actually worried that they might actually turn off the Chinese government. That's the level that some of these institutes are at right now. They've actually been able to solidify their places in universities. That's even more threatening. No institute, no government should ever have that strong of a bond with any school that the school is afraid to, put in other words, piss them off, right? And yeah, from personal perspective, I think it's a huge threat, and it's not just an exchange program.
Thanks again. Even just before we're about to launch our campaign, Confucius Institute campaign, in a couple of weeks now. But before we've even launched our campaign, we've had a really big victory with the Confucius Institute by shutting down by shutting down the Confucius Institute in Toronto, right? In Toronto schools. Could you tell us a little bit more about that campaign, about that victory?
Sure. So this is really a victory of the people. This is where a lot of Toronto residents, various groups, including Students for Free Tibet, joined in as a unified voice to say that the Confucius Institutes are an arm of the Chinese government. We don't need them to be talking to our children. We don't need them to be talking to second, third graders about how great China is, right? And the first time I personally noticed a problem with this was actually back in 2012. Nobody was talking about it. We were going to a Tibet Day event on provincial parliament, where we get to speak to members of provincial parliament, and I was looking what things could I talk about, and I knew that education was a provincial issue. So when I looked it up, I saw that there was already an agreement between Confucius Institutes and the Toronto District School Board, and I was shocked. I was like, how come no one's talking about this? This is a huge deal. The Toronto District School Board is already, has a huge agreement with the Confucius Institutes, and about almost a year after that, people were starting to now see this, and it's exactly what Pema talked about, how sneakily and how they disguise it as cultural programs, how they disguise it as harmless things, but in reality they're bringing an entire government's policies and propaganda into our education systems. So when this message started to rise, when people started to campaign around it, this was about 2 years ago now, then the trustees started to get worried, because even they didn't know. When I spoke to some of the trustees, they directly told me, I had no idea that this was passed, this agreement between Confucius and Toronto District School Board, and we were just sent a little note saying that this agreement has been passed. There was no explanation, nothing, right? And that's really another thing that we need to be worried about, is how sneakily they're getting passed and how they're really misusing the systems in order to get Confucius Institutes into our schools. Last year was one of the major periods when Toronto residents, various groups, including SFT, campaigned for this. We spoke to trustees, we lobbied and spoke to the executive director, and we rallied. We had public rallies. I provided a deputation along with various other groups. This was when the Canadian Security Intelligence Services also provided a deputation, and we spoke about why this needs to be stopped. But it wasn't all easy. The Chinese government has had their sides prepared too. In equal parts at the protest rallies, there were people bussed in by the Chinese government. They carried huge red Chinese flags, and obviously they didn't have a lot of slogans, because a lot of them actually were just arrived here in Canada. So what they had were like gongs, they had bells, and they were trying to drown out our voice, because that's probably what the Chinese embassy told them to do. They even provided deputations, and not one of their deputations was strong enough to convince the trustees, because when the decision time came, where the trustees were going to vote on whether or not TDSB should have Confucius in there, 21 out of 24 trustees voted to have it cancelled. They voted to have it terminated. That was a huge moment of victory for us, and I think we should still be celebrating to some extent, because it is a slap in the face of Chinese soft power programs. It must have been so embarrassing. But this is just a small victory. There's more than 400 Confucius Institutes around the world, and it's really troubling that a lot of universities have it. So I think in all, what I learned from this is that Confucius Institutes are passed so sneakily, so under the radar, that a lot of people don't know about it. When people are exposed to them, then they start to get worried. Even people who were, who didn't care much about the agreement in the beginning, people who didn't really think much of it. There was a trustee who actually apologized to the entire crowd on the final day. She said, "I truly apologize for not having, looked into this further, because this is a really troubling matter. And this is a matter of academic freedom." So for me, the biggest learning experience was we need to expose them. We need to really bring out the information, because people, including the staff, including heads of universities, they don't sometimes know better. It seems really, really innocuous, but it is a disguised Trojan horse, like the CSIS agent said.
Yeah, it's a tricky thing. Okay, so what are we doing? What is SFT doing about this? Ugen, Hemar, can one of you shed the members some light?
Yes, definitely. We think that there's a lot that we can all do as a group, as an organization, as individuals, as parents, students, as people working in the universities and schools, and just as, concerned citizens, for sure. We're not here to antagonize the universities or the schools. That's really not our goal. Our goal is that we want the universities and the decision makers in these schools to understand, the long-term repercussions of working so closely with the Chinese government. As Ugen was saying, some of them, they're not really aware. We want them to understand what it means to so closely work with China's propaganda arm, and we want to give them opportunity to, to do the right thing for their students, and also to safeguard themselves and, their academic standards, and to continue for the schools, free place where students can learn and develop. And currently we are in the process of engaging with universities that have a Confucius Institute, and we're urging them to have a closer look at the agreement. So as Students for a Free Tibet, we've actually been campaigning since last summer, since last August, and what we've been doing is we've been starting these conversations with the schools worldwide. I think we have sent out more than 200 letters, almost 300 letters worldwide at this point. I don't know the exact number right now.
About 20.
Say again? Okay. And yeah, and so we've been building up pressure away from the public eye at the moment, and I think it's coming to a point when we feel it's the right time to make this campaign very public, give everyone else a chance to join in, and what people can do is they can write to the universities, they can write to even the members. They're elected members of parliament, whether it's called a congressman in America or an MP in the UK, ministers, and demand that our governments have a closer look, a closer investigation into the relationship with the Chinese government in our universities and educational institutions. And there are really concrete action steps that you can take on campus, and for that what I would say is you should stay tuned. Students for Free Tibet is going to release an action kit very soon, along with other great materials, information, backgrounds, flyers that you can use in your area and on your campus to campaign. So stay tuned very soon.
Great, thank you. Ugen, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, like Pema said, we've already started approaching a lot of universities, and for now, every time we notice an issue of concern as a direct result of Confucius Institutes, we're challenging them head-on, because it is our responsibility, right? So that image that we showed earlier of the Tibetan dress worn by non-Tibetans without the consent of the Tibetan people or without any context, Those are the kind of things that we've been challenging. Just last week, one of our students for Free Tibet members, Yurin Samasang, she wrote a letter to the Brock Press saying that that was an insensitive depiction, a misappropriation of Tibetan culture as one of China's minorities. And the Brock Press immediately apologized. They took the image down from their article, and we've been, through these small successes by engaging them on these kind of issues. Right now, that's how we're kind of starting it off. But like Pema said, we are really intent on exposing them on a larger scale and helping the universities actually, protect their academic freedom.
That's wicked. I'm so glad. I saw that photograph, a couple of those images on Facebook, and it was disgusting. And so I'm so glad that this student did write in, and I think for any students out there or any supporters who come across these incidents, is to please do write to your schools and write to the education.
Yeah, I just want to add that, this is what it is, right? The student wearing the Tibetan dress probably didn't know any better. She didn't mean to offend Tibetans. The university didn't know that the Confucius Institute is misrepresenting Tibet, but it's happening, and it's happening in our watch. We need to remind them that it is inappropriate, insensitive. The problem is, as long as Confucius Institutes exist, they will keep doing this kind of insensitive, inappropriate, and taking academic freedom lower and lower. We shouldn't have to be challenging it here, but that's the reality today. We're challenging China in our schools. And it is our job as people of conscience, not just Tibetans, to do that.
And also to add on to that, what Ugen just said just makes me remind, of course, we are, as Students for Free Tibet, we are an organization dedicated to working towards a free Tibet, right? And so what the Chinese government is trying to do, whether it's with the Beijing Olympics in 2008, with the Beijing Winter or Summer Olympics bid that's being announced this year, whether it's the big trade relationships, whether it's the business relationships, or whether it's Xi Jinping shaking hands with Obama at the APEC summit in Beijing last year. What the Chinese government is trying to portray to everyone in the world is that China is this great nation. You can have them in our schools. There are no problems in China. There are no problems in Tibet. The Chinese government wants international recognition and acceptance, and the Confucius Institute is helping them in doing that by, finding a supposedly innocent or non-threatening way to get into our schools. But by doing that, the Chinese government, is just achieving to signal to the world that, everything is good in China. And I think that's what we're trying to combat in general as a campaigns organization in working, for the Tibetan cause, because things are really bad. And, we cannot allow that the Chinese government, has any right to show that there are no human rights abuses in China, that things are not as bad as they are in Tibet. And so I think, we have to challenge them, and we actually have to challenge them in our classrooms because, it's a very important space, and we have to defend it.
Damn straight. Okay, before we end, we have some questions coming in. We've got quite a few questions actually from our members. We have one from Anon from Washington, here in America, who's asking, what are the connections between the issues we are fighting for and the Confucius Institutes? What are the connections between the issues we are fighting for and the Confucius Institute?
I can take a first answer, and then maybe Pema, you can provide yours. So when we were asked not to bring the Tibetan flag, we were asked why. We were told that Tibet is not a recognized nation. And it's ridiculous that an educational institute, staff from an educational institute tell us that, because Students for Free Tibet is all about, we're fighting for Tibet's independence. A people get to decide what nation they belong to, not educational institutes, not governments, right? So if Tenzin, who was from Brock, wanted to represent her nation of Tibet, that is her freedom to do so. and that freedom was being challenged. In Tibet, you're not obviously allowed to raise the Tibetan flag. You're actually forced to raise the Chinese flag. People have been arrested and imprisoned for simply refusing to raise the Chinese flag. And here in Brock University, we're told that we can't bring the Tibetan flag. This is completely connected to what we're doing. It's attacking the legitimacy of the Tibetan issue. Tibetans should be the voice for Tibet, and right now in Confucius institutes are attempting to take that voice away.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I mean, we want to see a free Tibet. We want Tibetans to be able to reunite with His Holiness the Dalai Lama in Tibet. And in order to achieve that, we need to make the cost of China's occupation in Tibet as high as possible. And making this possible, we need to build political support for Tibet. We need world leaders to come together and speak out for Tibet. We need to ensure Tibetans remain a topic worldwide. We need to make sure that what Tibetans in Tibet are saying is being amplified outside Tibet with the governments, at summits, in the schools, in academia, in the textbooks, in the history books. We have to, we have a responsibility to ensure that the history of Tibet will not be forgotten. All of these things help us to ensure that there will be a free Tibet, that China is challenged. And, I think China is an expert in, mass manipulation, through, their propaganda machine, in influencing people. And I think in challenging that, we have to absolutely stop China from, moving into our free and democratic spaces, which are our schools. We need to ensure that, whatever for the last 20, 30, 40, 50 years, what Tibetans and non-Tibetans have been able to study about Tibet, yes, Tibet was a free country, and China invaded Tibet. We need to ensure that Tibet remains in these textbooks, that Tibet remains on the world map, and that Tibetans will not be forgotten. And in order to do that, we need to fight that democratic and free space. And I think, talking about campuses and schools, these are places, these are natural incubators of, students, campus organizing, and and the future, who are going to change our world, the people who are going to challenge China. And China's strategy of the Confucius Institute is trying to strangle these natural incubators of the next leadership, of people who are willing to stand up for justice worldwide. And this is more so a reason for non-Tibetans and non-Chinese and non-Tibet supporters of students to stand up on campuses and organize. And to us, or to me, all of this goes back to our overall goal, which is a free Tibet, and amplifying the Tibetan voices and ensuring that there are human rights in Tibet. And I think with this campaign we can do that.
Yes, definitely. Okay, I have a second question from Domar from California. Why do you think the CCP used Confucius in naming its program? Isn't the basis of Confucius Institute in a way going against Confucius's teachings of social, political, morality, etc.?
Yeah, that's such a good question. I asked myself that all the time. I think, yes, who was Confucius, right? Confucius was a philosopher and, famous Chinese thinker, known in the whole world. And actually, one of his most famous sayings is, "Do not do to others what you do not want done to yourself." Which are very wise words. And I think, if the Chinese government would listen to that, all the human rights abuses inside Tibet and China would have to stop, obviously. So it does kind of, go against naming one of their main soft power propaganda machines after this man, Confucius. But I think, and interestingly so, Confucius' teachings, and by the way, he was born about 500 years before the birth of Jesus Christ. So, that's a long time ago, more than 2,500 years. And so his teachings were actually banned under communist China. So after communist China took over China, they banned his teachings because his teachings were about moral ethics, how to respect your elders, how to have a good conduct and a compassionate conduct in society. So his teachings were actually banned because obviously these are morals that the Chinese government doesn't stand for. But I think what they're trying to do with their Confucius Institute, and which is why they named it after this man Confucius, is they're trying to model this so-called educational institution based on other similar institutions in the world. For example, in Germany, there's something called the Goethe Institute, or in Spain, there's something called the Cervantes Institute. And so, and what they do is they do provide free, language classes or cultural programs. So I think it was just a strategic way of trying to brand Confucius Institute as something that the Germans do, as something that the French or the Spanish do. But the difference is that those institutes are not funded by the government, and people of the embassy have no say in the politics of it. So I think they were trying to be strategic and trying to create a harmless image which already exists in the world, so that people don't suspect that there are political agendas being advanced in these classrooms.
Yeah, I completely agree. No one, I don't think any university would take on the China Propaganda Institute or anything that has Chinese government on it. So when you say Confucius Institute, it almost sounds non-threatening, very friendly, philosophical, high thinking kind of word. I think it was very strategic in their marketing side.
Thank you. Third question from Sonam in Oakland, California, I think. My school doesn't currently have a Confucius Institute, but there are actions I can take. But are there actions I can take to make sure my school won't contact them in the future?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. I think what we're trying to attempt with this campaign is to, erode China's influence in our schools. And, I was saying earlier that the Chinese government is trying to open, 1,000 Confucius Institutes by 2020. So not only do we have to, speak to the universities that already have Confucius Institutes, but I think with the controversy that, and there is a big controversy about the Confucius Institutes, people are very aware of it, and decision makers in those education institutions. What we have to do is we also have to reach out to them and, try to get them to pledge that they won't open a Confucius Institute. So what, was it Sonam? So what Sonam could actually do is, whether she's in a high school or college without a Confucius Institute, what she could really do is actually try to have a similar conversation as we did, but actually trying to ask them and to pledge to them not to open up a Confucius Institute in the first place. I think that's one thing that everyone can do. Another thing that people can do, what I said earlier, write to your elected member of parliament, your congressman, your MP, and ask them to launch an investigation, on a government level into this educational partnership with the Confucius Institute. Or a third thing you can do is you can actually also write to your educational minister and ask him the same thing. So I think these are three very easy things that you could do. Write to your school, ask them not to open a Confucius Institute, write to your member of parliament or your educational minister to start an investigation, because that's something that has been done in other countries as well. And wait for our action kit, number 4.
And if you're considering going to San Francisco State University, they have a Confucius Institute. So local organizing, I think, raising awareness about them.
Cool. And then there's one more question. So we've written to over 300 schools, universities around the world. What are some of the responses that we've got?
Yeah, so we wrote to so many institutes, and the responses have been very interesting, sometimes disappointing, sometimes surprising, and sometimes also very insightful. But what is very interesting, that even though we have written to, more than 300 universities, we're kind of getting the same responses. I would say there are about 4 to 5 different kind of responses we are getting. So one very common response is, oh, our Confucius Institute is so unique from the others. It's so different. And then we usually follow up with the question, well, if this is so, then please explain to us what you have done to ensure that, and then we challenge them. Another thing that people say is, we value academic freedom, we are dedicated to academic freedom, so don't worry. And then again, we ask them, well, what have you done to say you're ensuring academic freedom? Because if you read the Confucius Institute contract, which is, by the way, available on the Hanban website publicly, there are very concerning clauses about having a non-disclosure article. Basically what it means, you can do everything in secrecy. There are no review processes in terms of canceling or opening up a new or renewing the agreement. And also one very concerning clause is that the Confucius Institute, the host university, has to abide to China's laws, which, is very problematic. So usually we go back to them and say, so if you indeed actually value academic freedom, what have you done about this clause that says this university now has to abide to China's laws? The response is sometimes also that people are actually saying, oh, thank you for your letter, we're actually looking into this. We have followed the controversy, and we are reviewing our situation or our standpoint with the Confucius Institute. And then others are very bordering aggressive, who are kind of praising China, or who don't even answer any questions and just reject. And I have also met with a few of these people, and usually these are the people who are getting a lot out of having a partnership with the Chinese government. These are the people who have fancy overseas travels in China, who are being wined and dined by the Chinese government, who are being pranced around in China. And and then there are also some other and some actually pledge their integrity on Tibet as well. Yeah, and so, but it's basically 4 to 5 different responses we get. But with either all of these responses, there's a lot we can do in following up, and that's what we're doing at the moment. We're not letting them off the hook.
Definitely not. Okay, great. Thank you, guys. That's pretty much all we have time for. If there's any last words or thoughts that you'd like to share with our members, people watching, please do share.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out, I was born in Nepal, so if you look at the state of Nepal today, it has changed immensely in the past since when I left there and now, which is like more than 15 years now. Tibetans are not even allowed to celebrate the birthday of His Holiness in the Buddha Stupa, which is a really religious place. Forget protesting for Tibetan freedom. Forget any kind of advocacy. One person was arrested for having a Free Tibet shirt. In an obscure place, he was arrested by the police. The Chinese government recently announced another, I don't know, $30 million of funding or so to the Nepalese government. They're basically buying off. They bought off the Nepalese government. Tibetans have no freedom there, and it's a really precarious situation for them. It's really shameful that the place I was born in is now going through this kind of repression. And I'm sure when the Nepalese government first, got into these contracts and deals, they looked very harmless. They're like, oh, they're just helping infrastructure development. Oh, they're just, supporting our, cities and blah blah blah. But then it comes with all these conditions. Make sure that you support our version of, our line on Tibet. Make sure you support, unified China, one China policy. Make sure, you don't allow any kind of protests. And they have openly assured that. The Nepalese government has openly, I think it was the president, just like a week ago, recently assured the Chinese government that they will stick to China's policy, not allow any anti-Chinese movement on their soil. The Confucius Institutes are the Chinese government's way of buying into the West, buying into other places around the world. The Nepalese government, they've pretty much bought directly, I would say, but other places around the world, they're doing through these educational institutes. Like Pema Dharma said, people really feel like they have so much invested because there's so much money being pumped into these universities. There's staff are being taken to Beijing, they're being taken all around China and given wonderful trips and accommodations, covered kind of lodging and everything, and they feel like now they have to give something back to the Chinese government, and I feel like that's a false. I think it's a really, really concerning that these kind of relationships are being formed directly between our school staff and the Chinese government. I just wanted to end with that word. Look at where Nepal is today. It's really unfortunate, and we need to fight this kind of influence.
Emma, do you have any last thing?
Say no to China's Confucius Institutes. Take action.
Exactly. Let's take action. Okay, great. Thank you so much, guys, for being here today. Yeah, so basically the Confucius Institute is the Chinese government, and they are a threat to academic freedom. They are a threat to the 3 Ts, as Eugen pointed out, Taiwan, Tibet, and Tiananmen movement. And so, yeah, please get in touch with SFT. We'll be launching the campaign very shortly. Email us, and we will definitely help with any talking points, any materials that you need for this campaign to be successful. We can do this together. We can shut this down and protect academic freedom and protect Tibet in our schools in the free world. I just want to say stay tuned for our next Lhakar series. That will be on May 6th. We'll be putting out more information shortly about what that topic will be. Thank you so much, guys.
Thanks for having us, Pema.
Thanks. Bye.
Thanks, Pema.